If you were to ask any football fan from around the world which is the most heated rivalry within the sport, it wouldn't be at all surprising to hear them reply, the Old Firm. But why is a fixture between two teams from the 18th ranked league in UEFA's coefficient so well known and still so revered? Welcome to Sports Simplified, and this is the history of the Old Firm. Before there was the Old Firm, there was industrial Glasgow. By the late 1800s, the city had become one of the most important in the entire British Empire. Shipyards along the River Clyde built vessels that sailed across the globe. Steel, coal, engineering, this was a powerhouse of industry. But it was also a city under strain. Thousands of Irish immigrants moved to Scotland throughout the 19th century, particularly after the Great Famine of the 1840s. Many of them settled in Glasgow's working-class East End. They were poor, majority Catholic, and frequently unwelcome. Now, it's important for us to remember that sectarian tensions weren't created by football. They were already commonplace throughout employment, housing, politics, and religion. Football didn't create the divide, it simply compressed these animosities into the pressure cooker of a crowded stadium. Rangers were founded in 1872 by a group of young Protestants, Peter Campbell, David Hill, William Macbeth, and brothers Moses and Peter McNeill. The group were actually rowing enthusiasts who were supposedly inspired by witnessing football matches being played on Glasgow Green. They had no explicit political agenda. In their early years, Rangers were simply a football club competing in a growing Scottish game. 15 years later, in 1887, and the Celtic Football Club was established by brother Wilfred, a Marist from Sligo in Ireland. But the original conception wasn't purely based around sport. The club was established to alleviate poverty amongst Irish Catholic immigrants in Glasgow's East End. It was a model inspired by the work of Hibernian Football Club, who were founded a few years prior in Edinburgh. In fact, in their first ever fixture against Rangers in the May of 1888, Celtic won 5-2, having borrowed a number of guest players from the Edinburgh side. Originally, the club was a fundraising mechanism. It was a social institution before it ever became a footballing one. From the beginning, Celtic's identity was explicitly tied to the Irish Catholic community, whereas Rangers were not initially framed in opposition, but over time they became more culturally aligned with the Protestant Unionist population of Glasgow. By the early 20th century, the fault lines were drawn. Two clubs, two stadiums, two communities, and increasingly so, two very different ideas of what it meant to be Scottish. To understand the Old Firm, we have to zoom out, beyond football and beyond Glasgow, to look at Britain and Ireland at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. You see, Ireland was still under British rule at the time. The debate around Irish Home Rule and later full independence greatly intensified over the early years of the 1900s. The very idea of identity was becoming increasingly polarised across the British Isles. But nowhere outside of Ireland were these tensions more palpable than in Glasgow. But these conflicts were no longer merely cultural, they were becoming actively political. In 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill was introduced in Westminster, proposing limited self-government for Ireland while still remaining under British control. Across Britain, it sparked fierce debate between both Unionists and Irish Republicans. In Glasgow, these arguments echoed within the Old Firm matches. Support or opposition to Irish autonomy was in no way theoretical. Many families within the city still had direct ties to Ireland. The footballing rivalry had become a proxy arena for wider socio-political questions. Should Ireland govern itself? Which nation demands people's loyalty? And were Scottish and British identities inseparable from one another? Over time, the social and political tensions facing Britain on a wider scale helped to reinforce the identities of the Old Firm. Celtic supporters often identified with Irish nationalism. Irish tricolours, Republican songs, and references to events from across the Irish Sea became commonplace within matchday culture. Rangers supporters, meanwhile, became increasingly aligned to the ideals of British unionism, loyalty to the Crown, and Protestant heritage. Union Jacks and Orange Order symbols became visible markers of these identities. In fact, even today, if you were to go to an Old Firm derby, you'd be unlikely to find an abundance of Scottish symbology. Instead, a clash of Union Jacks and Irish flags would confront you wherever you turned. These weren't just preferences, however, they were declarations, and sometimes these identities collided violently. In 1980, after Celtic defeated Rangers in the Scottish Cup final at Hampden Park, thousands of fans filled the field. What followed was not celebration, but brutal fighting between rival fans. Bottles and fists were thrown, and running battles erupted across the turf before police on horseback eventually restored order. These images shocked Scotland. The riot became a defining landmark of just how combustible the Old Firm rivalry had become, and directly contributed to the banning of alcohol from Scottish football matches in 1981, a restriction that is still in place decades later. Now, it is important for us to be precise here. Neither club's entire support can be broken down into just religious or political affiliations. Modern Glasgow is far more complex and secular than that. But historically, these connections matter deeply. When Celtic and Rangers met, it wasn't just about football. It was about putting Scottish identity under a national microscope, disguised as a sporting spectacle. Strip away the politics and what you're left with is two of European football's most successful clubs. Celtic's crowning achievement came in 1967. Under Jock Stein, the Lisbon Lions became the first British team to win the European Cup. Incredibly, the entire team were born within a 30-mile radius of Celtic Park. Rangers answered in 1972, winning the European Cup Winners' Cup, defeating Dynamo Moscow 3-2 in the final. Domestically, the dominance is staggering. Between Celtic and Rangers, there are 110 Scottish titles, split perfectly evenly with 55 apiece. In fact, since the formation of the Scottish Football League in 1890, there have only been 19 seasons where neither club came out on top. This isn't just rivalry, it is the lifeblood of the Scottish game. When Rangers went into liquidation and were forced to restart in the lower leagues back in 2012, Scottish football suffered greatly. Broadcast deals, sponsorship fees, and crowd attendances all fell during Rangers' exile. The duo's dominance was the entire engine behind Scottish football, whether the two fan bases of the clubs can appreciate the dependency they have on one another or not. So where does the Old Firm stand today? Well, Glasgow is different now. Scotland is a more secular and multicultural place, and younger fans are less likely to identify along religious lines compared to previous generations. Both clubs actively campaign against sectarianism, but the edge within the rivalry does still remain. The stadiums still shake, the noise is still ferocious, the stakes still feel existential. Because at its core, the Old Firm is about belonging. It's about a shared history carried forward through ritual, songs, scarves, and Saturday afternoons. And in a world that is increasingly saturated by global superclubs, few rivalries truly do stand the test of time. Even those such as Inter versus Milan, El Clasico, or Boca versus River Plate fail to carry the same layered intensity of culture, faith, class, and sport as the Old Firm. However, with Scottish football's stature within the game waning, many have speculated as to the possibility of the two clubs joining the English Football League system, much like Welsh sides Swansea City, Cardiff City, and Wrexham. Whilst it would tear the two away from their homeland somewhat, it could finally see them invest in their potential and possibly reach the heights of Europe's elite once again. The Old Firm isn't just a story of two football clubs, it's the story of an entire city, of immigration, of identity, of division, and occasionally unity. For over a century, Celtic and Rangers have defined each other. Because without one, the other would simply not be the same. It is a fractious yet reciprocal relationship that has become a central pillar within the culture of an entire nation. That's what makes it more than just a footballing rivalry. That is what makes it the Old Firm.